conference, Russia and U.S. ultimatum for elections, no NATO troops in Ukraine, as Zelensky is in incredible panic. Russia and the U.S. have essentially paved the way for a more comprehensive and bolder agreement, starting with peace in Ukraine and later for a fairer distribution of global power. A historic but incomplete diplomatic step took place today, February 18, in Riyadh, Saudi Arabia, where the U.S. and Russian delegations, led by Foreign Minister Sergei Lavrov and Marco Rubio, respectively, held extensive talks on ending the war in Ukraine, as well as on all Russian-American relations. In a contradictory and complex geopolitical environment, Russia and the United States essentially paved the way for a more comprehensive and bolder agreement, starting with peace in Ukraine, and later for a fair distribution of global power. Although many analysts, especially on the Russian side, were wary of the results of the 5-hour Lavrov-Rubio meeting, Russia can be described as the winner of the negotiations, as it, together with the Trump administration, sent an ultimatum to Zelensky in which the two powers demanded the holding of presidential elections in Ukraine. In fact, several foreign diplomatic sources of the American network Fox News reported that forcing Ukraine to hold new elections could be the backbone of a peace agreement. Both the U.S. and Russia believe that Ukrainian President Volodymyr Zelensky has little chance of being re-elected, the same sources report. The two powers almost made it clear that they are leaving behind the absurd regime of unfair sanctions against the Russian Federation. In fact, after the summit, U.S. Secretary of State Marco Rubio made it clear that pressuring the Europeans to abandon the absurd anti-Russian sanctions would be the only reason why it would make sense for the EU to get involved in any negotiations. As for the camp of the losers, Zelensky is now trying to form a confrontational front against the new Russian-American order and to take the European Union, Great Britain, but also Turkey's Tayyip Erdogan on his side. The head of the Kiev regime, during his meeting with the Turkish president in Ankara, even stressed that Ukraine will not accept the ultimatum sent to it by Russia and the U.S. The 3 steps of the Russian-U.S. peace plan for Ukraine. According to Fox News journalist Jackie Heinrich, Russia and the United States have proposed a peace plan for Ukraine. This plan includes 3 main stages: a ceasefire, elections in Ukraine, and the signing of the final agreement. The White House, according to available information, has not yet commented on these developments, but is expected to do so soon. The State Department, for its part, stated that a single meeting between the Russia and U.S. delegation is not enough for lasting peace, as diplomatic efforts are still at an early stage. At the same time, according to official Tammy Bruce, a significant step forward was made in Riyadh, Saudi Arabia. For his part, the advisor to the Russian president, Yuri Ushakov, spoke about the state of contacts with the U.S. on the issue of Ukraine. As he explained, separate negotiating teams will be created to resolve the crisis. The first practical actions: Russia and the U.S. form a negotiating committee. In the meantime, Trump's special envoy to the country, Keith Kellogg, is urgently traveling to Ukraine without the reason yet being known. And according to the first statements, the two sides agreed on the negotiators who will talk about the Ukrainian issue, while they briefly discuss the conditions required for a summit between Presidents Vladimir Putin and Donald Trump. Also, after nearly 4.5 hours of consultations, they agreed in principle to create a mechanism to address the critical issues that are subject of disagreement in order to reach a possible agreement between the two leaders more quickly. We agreed to create a consultative mechanism to address problems in bilateral relations in order to take the necessary measures to normalize the work of our diplomatic missions, the State Department statement said. Russia and the United States discussed investments, lifting sanctions, and reopening embassies. The issue of future investments was also raised at the meeting of the Russian and American delegation in Riyadh. According to Reuters, the talks may concern the period after the signing of the peace agreement in Ukraine. One of the specific results of the meeting was the agreement to restore the staff of the embassies of the two countries. However, the U.S. Secretary of State did not specify whether it's possible to expand the diplomatic staff in Russia. Before the imposition of restrictions, the number of American employees at the embassy in Moscow was several times that of the Russian diplomatic mission in Washington. The U.S. Secretary of State also states that some of the sanctions against Russia imposed by West should be lifted after the conflict in eastern Ukraine is resolved. As he pointed out, the main issue at the moment is mutual concessions. At the same time, he noted that the European Union, the EU, should reconsider its policy regarding sanctions. The last convulsions of the Finnish president, Zelensky, Ukraine will not accept an ultimatum from US and Russia, he said. Ukraine will not comply with any ultimatum if it's set by the United States and Russia, Zelensky said during a press conference at the Ukrainian embassy in Ankara, Turkey. The Ukrainian president expressed the impression that the US is now discussing with Russia the same ultimatum that Putin had set at the beginning of the full-scale war. Once again, they're discussing Ukraine without Ukraine. I wonder if at the most difficult moment we did not accept such ultimatums. Where does the feeling come from that we will do it now, Zelensky stressed. Zelensky calls for fair peace talks. At the same time, Zelensky called for fair peace talks aimed at ending the Russian invasion of Ukraine, arguing that the negotiations should involve the European Union, Turkey, and the United Kingdom. The Ukrainian president criticized today's talks between the United States and Russia, noting that no representative of Ukraine was participating. The talks are being held between representatives of Russia and the United States of America, again for Ukraine and again without Ukraine, he said. Europe in the broad sense, which includes the European Union, Turkey, and the United Kingdom, should participate in the talks and the formation of necessary security guarantees with the United States regarding the future of our region, he said. Zelensky also revealed that he had postponed his planned visit to Saudi Arabia, which was due to take place on Wednesday, suggesting that he did not want his trip to be linked to the talks between the United States and Russia. Lavrov sets Russia's red line after meeting with Rubio. Not a single NATO soldier in Ukraine, he said. The presence of NATO troops on Ukrainian territory is unacceptable for the Russian Federation, Russian Foreign Minister Sergei Lavrov made clear after historic talks with his American counterpart Marco Rubio. Lavrov said that during the negotiations, there was talk of the possible deployment of armed forces or peacekeeping troops, supposedly after the conflict is resolved or an agreement is reached. We explained today that the appearance of troops, armed forces from the same NATO countries, even if they are under a foreign flag, under the flag of the European Union or under national flags, does not change anything in essence. This, of course, is unacceptable for us, the Russian minister stressed. There is reason to believe that the American side has begun to listen to Russia's position, Russian Foreign Minister Sergei Lavrov added after meeting with the Americans in Saudi Arabia today. According to him, Russia and the United States agreed that everything should be done to combine the geopolitical spheres and economic affairs. Our dialogue was, in my opinion, very useful. We also listened to each other, and I have every reason to believe that the American side has begun to better understand our position. During the negotiations, the delegations discussed improved relations, and this was quite successful, the Russian minister said. Lavrov also thanked the Saudi authorities for the opportunity to talk to the two countries. In addition, the head of Russian diplomacy explained that the U.S. proposed a moratorium on attacks on energy facilities in Russia and Ukraine. He also stated that the U.S. calls the report on the three-point plan for Ukraine false. Historic step by the U.S. after meeting with Lavrov, Foreign Minister Rubio calls on the European Union to end unreasonable sanctions on Russia. And during the meeting with Russian Minister Sergei Lavrov in Riyadh, U.S. Secretary of State Marco Rubio stressed the importance of the two key elements in resolving the conflict. The first is that the only leader in the world who can make this happen, who can bring the parties together to start serious talks, is President Trump, he said. The second point, according to Rubio, is that in order for a conflict to end, everyone involved has to accept any agreement. He described today's meeting as the first step in a long and difficult journey. He acknowledged that to achieve peace, all sides have to make concessions, but noted that those concessions should not be predetermined. Rubio hinted that the European Union might play a role at a later stage, saying there are other actors who have imposed sanctions. The European Union will have to come to the negotiating table at some point because they have imposed sanctions as well. Regarding the ultimate goal, he said, the goal is to end this conflict in a way that's fair, lasting, sustainable, and acceptable to all parties. What exactly does that solution look like? That is what the ongoing consultations will determine. According to him, the U.S. is aimed for a final, not a temporary, solution to the Ukrainian problem and seeks to act quickly. At the same time, Trump wants to end the war fairly so that it does not happen again in 2 or 3 years. For his part, Trump's national security advisor, Mike Waltz, stated that U.S. allies are consulting on the issue of Ukraine and no one is standing on the sidelines. He noted that the U.S. president is determined to hold negotiations as soon as possible that will touch on the issue. Rubio Dombrovskis' commission statements anger the European Union. Europe has its security in its own hands. The commission responded in a clearly angry tone to U.S. Secretary of State Marco Rubio, who had earlier stated that he wanted the European Union to be involved in the negotiation process, given that the EU has imposed its own sanctions on Russia. The European Union will have to sit at the negotiating table at some point because it has also imposed sanctions, he said. However, EU Commissioner for Economy and Trade Valdis Dombrovskis, when asked earlier whether the EU was prepared to follow the U.S. lead on sanctions, appeared cautious. Dombrovskis says, I think it's clear, especially with the current Trump administration, that the EU should take a more active role in matters concerning its security. This also applies to sanctions policy. He also confirmed that work is continuing on the preparation of the 16th sanctions package. Humiliated EU in panic. Fredriksson from Denmark says what Europe is experiencing is worse than the Cold War. Danish Prime Minister Mette Fredriksson warned the Danish parliament that the current geopolitical and security situation is worse than the Cold War, calling for a drastic increase in the country's defense spending. During a question and answer session with ministers of European parliaments, Fredriksson updated Parliament on last night's talks in Paris. We are in much more difficult and more dangerous security situation than any in my lifetime. This situation is worse than the Cold War, she said. She also warned that Russia could once again find itself in a position to attack Ukraine or other countries if the peace settlement is not durable and does not include sustainable security guarantees. Confirming yesterday's media reports, Fredriksson told ministers of parliament that her government would present new plans Wednesday, tomorrow, February 19, which would give the chief of staff additional powers to make rapid decisions on defense procurement. The negotiators in Riyadh, the U.S. was represented by Secretary of State Marco Rubio, White House National Security Advisor Mike Waltz, and U.S. Middle East Envoy Steve Witkoff, while the Russian delegation was led by Foreign Minister Sergei Lavrov and Yuri Ushakov, an advisor to Russian President Vladimir Putin. Also at the negotiating table were Saudi Foreign Minister Prince Faisal bin Farhan Al Saud and National Security Advisor Mossad bin Mohammed Al Iban. The Russian-U.S. talks came just a month after Donald Trump took office and reflect a significant departure from Washington's position under the Biden administration, which avoided public contacts, concluded that Russia was not serious about ending the war. Ukraine and Europe out of talks. It's noted that the talks were held without the participation of representatives of Ukraine or delegations from Europe. Ukrainian President Zelensky said that Kiev is not going to participate in the meetings between Russia and U.S., even if it is persistently asked. According to political analyst Sergei Markov, the absence of Europe and Ukraine from negotiations is due to several reasons. The main one, he says, is that EU and Ukraine want the conflict to continue, while the talks in Riyadh are aimed at peace. At the same time, he argued that the leaders of Russia and the U.S. are potential allies in terms of values, ideology, and philosophy, while Zelensky and the EU are their opponents. In addition, the political analyst stressed that the talks do not concern exclusively Ukraine, but also bilateral relations between Russia and the US, as well as global security issues. Finally, he noted that Ukraine and the EU countries are not fully independent states like Russia and the US. Russia announced progress in negotiations with the US in Riyadh. In turn, the advisor to the Russian President, Yuri Ushakov, summarized the meeting, stating that the negotiations developed positively. He said, "The delegations had a very serious discussion on all issues. The Russian side noted that it is still early to talk about compromise with the US, but a good start was made." While Kirill Dmitriev, member of the Russian delegation and head of the Russian Direct Investment Fund, RDIF, said the talks were held with mutual respect and on equal terms. Russian Foreign Ministry spokeswoman Maria Zakharova said the Riyadh meeting showed that the US is serious about a new dialogue, including on the Ukraine issue. She added that the two sides discussed issues relating to Russian-American relations, which have accumulated over the past 3 years. For his part, the first deputy head of the Federation Council's Defense Committee, Vladimir Chizhov, said that the negotiations could be the beginning of a broader dialogue. He called the meeting a success, stressing, "And this is not the end, but rather the beginning of a dialogue that will continue." And this is from Banking You in Greece. Please leave your comments. Thank you for your support. Support my Patreon account. The daily posts are 5 videos daily, and they are totally different from what I have on my YouTube channel. Thank you so much for your support and that you find all my content so interesting. You'll find the Patreon account details in the description box below.